The competitive 40K network presents Art of War. Art of War. Strategy and tactics. Discussions with the best players on the planet. Now your host, Nick Nanavati.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another super exciting Art of War episode. Today we have a return special guest and my teammate from Team America, Brian Seipp. Brian, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me on.
And we're super excited to have you. And you just came straight off of a run where you went undefeated with the new Thousand Sons at the Glasshammer Open with over 100 people in attendance. That is seriously impressive. I know Thousand Sons just got their rules redone, and we have not had them on the show. So I'm super eager to hear how you break them down, what your list was, how it all works, and that good stuff. And then, of course, in part two, for our patrons, we're going to go round by round through your whole tournament, Brian. We're going to talk about your deployments, your strategy, your tactics, your spell casting, wizardry, and we're going to try to unpack the mystery that is Thousand Sons a little bit here. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah, man, sounds great. You know, I'm always excited to share my Hogwarts acceptance letter with other people.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm excited too. You can subscribe right now, folks, to patreon.com/AOW40K to get access to this episode, along with 298 other episodes and our Discord server, where you can talk directly to Brian. All right, let's just get into this. Brian, talk to me about what is going on with your Thousand Sons. I mean, last time you were on the show, it was like last year. You were playing Orcs. You had just been crushing it with Wog Tribe, and now you're a wizard. What happened?
You know, Thousand Sons are one of these armies which is really, really close to my heart. I played them last year at WTC. I have a really, really pretty Thousand Sons army. And so they've always been an army which I think kind of rewards, you know, really, really good play and has a really high skill cap if you want to try and like exercise a bunch of skill expression, and that's something which resonates with me. You know, it's in a totally different way from orcs, which is always really cool. Plus, they got a new book just came out, and it's an opportunity to really kind of try some stuff out.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. So I've got to ask, how do you balance playing Orcs, which are like this melee all threat overload approach to an army, and then Thousand Sons, which are like this very careful, calculated approach to Warhammer? It's like, to me, outsider looking in, it's two opposite play styles. I mean, you might find that thrilling, but how do you manage it?
You know, it's funny you say that, because it's actually one of the reasons I play the armies I play, like kind of in my rotation, are specifically because they're opposite play styles, right? So when I first kind of started getting into 40K, I initially had started playing with Tau, you know, this mono-phase shooting army. It's an army I still love and play every now and then as well. And then my next army was Orcs, and I did them specifically because I didn't know much about the combat phase, and I wanted to learn about it. I wanted to get better at it. And then with Thousand Sons, it became this army which really rewards, you know, passive, slower play, understanding how the game's playing out into tempo, which is something which is not really what Orcs are trying to do, right? Orcs are trying to punch in the mouth and see how well you can take that punch and keep fighting. So this is another opportunity for me to kind of branch into a totally new space that allowed me to develop skills that were otherwise weaker, make me a more well-rounded, better player overall. And it's the end result of that is that I'm able to leverage the skills that I kind of honed with other extremes in forms of Orcs and Tau, and pull them into Thousand Sons. So I'm able to execute really, really good combat maneuvers with my Thousand Sons rubrics charging in that might not otherwise be there for another person who's only playing Thousand Sons, for example, and then just focus on the part of the army which is unique, which is that kind of tempo, passive play while burning down your opponent's resources and really, really kind of controlling the pace of the game.
That's amazing, dude. I love that. It's learning like the opposite extremes of what armies can do in Warhammer, Tau, Orcs, Thousand Sons, so different to each other, as a way to like become a better player, basically. You know, you can apply this Orc savagery to the wizard brain, and I'm sure your Orcs and your Tau can benefit from a more calculated, tempo-based approach from Thousand Sons. Do you find like it's difficult to maybe see the forest through the trees, if you will? Like if you're playing Thousand Sons and you're looking for how you can charge with your Rubric Marines or Magnus and to create a complicated combat situation, you're not thinking about necessarily the things that Thousand Sons should be thinking about, or vice versa. Like when you're thinking about tempo control with Orcs, are you missing some combat plays?
Yeah, I think I think that with either army, it's important to really focus on the things that are the most important, like tenets, right? And just look at things like, for example, when you're playing Thousand Sons, don't try and execute combat like shenanigans and confusing scenarios for your opponent, like you might do an orc army, as a tactic that you're trying to achieve. But just look for, if you see an opportunity where you can do so, and it doesn't violate that core tenet of what the army's trying to do, then it's great to kind of exercise those skills again. And the fact that you play those armies, the fact that I play orcs, means that I'm seeing those opportunities I might not otherwise see, because of the fact that I'm actively looking for them when I am playing orcs, for example. And it kind of same with the orcs. It's my ability, the fact that I'm playing T-Suns now, and I think a better grasp of kind of how to control the tempo and how the tempo of a game is moving in general. I'm able to kind of gauge when I should be, declaring a wog, or when I should be pushing or not pushing. It's not just always turn two, slam it out. You're able to kind of really pace it out significantly better. And I think it's kind of like with everything, if you, as you begin to kind of maybe sand down the areas where you're a little weaker, right? You become this more well-rounded player who is able to apply these, and you just try and lean into the things that the army's good at and have that be your primary focus, with the other skills just being tools in your tool set.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really unique approach to learning Warhammer, and I think it served you really well. I don't know that I've ever seen anyone manage such different play styles to such proficiency. That's a very unique skill set that you have, Brian. I think that's awesome. So let's kind of move the conversation a little bit from your overall approach to Thousand Sons. And you mentioned they're a very tempo, slow the game down style army. What does that actually mean in terms of moves you make on the Warhammer table? How are you playing your Thousand Sons at a high level?
Yeah, so for me, I kind of view Thousand Sons as this army which is eventually going to execute a really powerful kind of go turn, as people call it, right? So it's this turn where you're going to end up activating devastating wounds in your army, and you're going to want to use most of your army to kill as much of their army as possible, right? But until you get to that point, they're still a very fragile army with a bunch of, essentially just 30 tactical marines, even in the large size of uh, when you have lots of rubrics, it's still 30 tactical marines that are running around, with textbooks to read spells from, right? And so the um, the time between when the game starts and when you want to execute that big turn, um, is this, I see it as this escalating ladder, where you want to engage with the opponent with the minimum amount necessary to force them to activate and play the game into you. And the idea being that you can burn down their resources that are also designed to do that, and also dictate how much of a commitment they have to give into certain spaces, so that you can pull them out to the point where around that turn 3, maybe turn 4, it depends on which army you're playing and how, you can execute that really big turn, which just kind of finishes the game off. And so that's where kind of like a lot of my list design comes in too, is looking at that as this ladder that you want to climb, and I want to have as many different rungs on that ladder where I can apply different resources to different things, at different times.
Yeah, I love that answer. I think the way you described it, basically trying to use trade resources and whatever to draw your opponent forward to then hit them with like a hellacious damage turn, makes perfect sense. I know my perspective on Thousand Suns that they just do crazy damage, like absolutely astronomical. You're just dead here damage. And if you can apply it, then you've won the game essentially because you've killed your opponent. So the trick is then in getting to apply it, because you're not the type of army like orcs per se that can just run across the table and apply the damage the old-fashioned way. You've got to kind of engage your opponent in this chess battle of trying to get them to commit so that you can apply your damage. What is the list you actually took to this tournament? I'm so curious to hear that. Then we'll break it down further.
Yeah, so I went with Grand Coven, which is the kind of version of index detachment that previously existed. It's a new form. It's kind of like a Gladius version of Thousand Sons, where they have 3 abilities they can choose, make their second weapons better each turn. A lot of similar strats to the index. And so my Warlord was Magnus, still an excellent piece. Then I have an Exalted Sorcerer on disc. He has an upgrade that allows him to use a Doombolt once per game for a second time. He also gives the unit he's with Lone Op 18, and he joins a unit of 6 Tzaangor Enlightened, which are the bows. I'm sure people have been seeing raved about. They're quite good for their points as well. Good damage. Then I have 3 more characters that are going to be joining Rubric. So I have 2 Infernal Masters, one of which has the I believe it's called the Eldritch Vortex of something now, but it's the Arcane Vortex that people knew from the Index, exactly the same rules. And then we have a Sorcerer with the Umbralefic Crystal. And those go in 3 of my Rubric squads. And then I have 1 additional Rubric squad, which doesn't have a character attached. Kind of another one of those rungs on the ladder. And then I have 3 Tzaangor Shamans, who are these kind of like action pieces that allow me to kind of control some space and such with them. Thousand Suns Rhino, 10 Tzaangors, 3 more Tzaangor Enlightened with bows, and then 2 Vortex beasts.
Beautiful, nice, compact. I'm not gonna lie, it kind of looks like every other Thousand Suns list to me. Magnus, a couple Vortex Beasts, Rubric Marines, and a gaggle of characters. But obviously, it's about how you use it, and like, there's a lot of specificity in the choices you've made with this design to kind of facilitate that overall game plan of deliver the damage. So, in your brain, Brian, how does this army work at like a strategic level?
Yeah, so I mean, so we kind of talk about some of these rungs on the ladder, right? So you start, you have these something as low as a Tzaangor Shaman, this little character's OC2 can run out and contest the objective with a transport on it, can run into the middle and do an area denial or something, but it's something your opponent has to kill. Then you can walk up the ladder a little more and have something like 10 Tzaangors, which is this 10-man unit, which has the ability to block a bunch of space, tag things, move block, prevent your opponent from kind of operating into a space so you can stage more aggressively if you want to. Then you can move up to something like 5 Rubric Marines without a character, where you want to maybe somebody puts JPIs in the middle to kill that Tzaangor Shaman you had previously done. I could put 5 Rubric Space Marines for 100 points in there and not have to worry about feeling bad about putting one of your character units in there to kill them. And then you go up to the Mutilated Vortex Beast, which is kind of this level of commitment where they will die, but they require a real piece, at a minimum, a real piece, like a Vindicator with Oath on it is going to be required to take down something like this, or multiple other assets. You know, a JPI squad's not taking out a Vortex piece, for example, right? And then you can use that to stand on objectives, to control your expansion, to pull your opponent towards you, and all of those tools are really about just getting your opponent to use their things as much as possible, because when you do your big turn, you want to be able to hit as much of their stuff as possible. And so by pulling out all their smaller pieces, you're forcing them to, by the time the game reaches that stage, be playing the game with their real assets. You're not keeping them in reserve and protecting them to make sure that you can hit them or they can counterattack with them, right? So that's where that kind of macro level tempo control is coming from.
So you're trying to draw your opponent out with the Mutilated Vortex Beasts as like the main function because it requires something real, and then you get to kill something real, that substantive army they have. And in basic Trade War, you can still like compete. You have so many little trash units with your Tzaangor Enlightened and your Shamans and your Naked Rubrics. Like you have various differing degrees of OC and commitment level, all the way up to a Mutilated Beast, which requires like heavy commitment. How do you determine which unit to put out on the objective when?
Um, that's a good question. I mean, some of it is vibes based, right? I mean, I'm kind of just feeling how I feel like the game is rolling out, but a lot of it has to do with kind of what pieces and specifically I'm trying to pull out. You know, I mean, if I'm trying to pull and what pieces my opponent has as well. So to continue with the thread, for example, of Space Marines, I could put a Tzaangor Shaman onto a objective somewhere. If it's not somewhere where he's going to be able to easily draw guns onto it, maybe it pulls out a scout squad, right? And that might be all I want to do. But I could also maybe it pulls out a JPI squad. Tzaangors, for example, is a good example where they probably pull something like that. And then then it's about kind of just identify, what are they, what kind of tools do they have, and what can they use, and what can they use to try and play the game with, so that by the time they get to the late game, they don't really have these little tools that can do actions while their big things are killing me.
So it's kind of based on like what your opponent's list is naturally a little weak at.
Yeah, exactly. I'm really definitely, it's some of it's army based, but a lot of it, some of it's like army based, like Space Marines versus Orcs versus whatever. But a lot of it is really the specific list that they brought, right? How greedy are they? How much chaff do they actually bring? How are they going to be able to kill my stuff? How difficult is it for them to kill Magnus? What are the pieces that they have to use to do that? Is there a way I can put something in a spot where the only way he can kill it is to use a Vindicator that is going to be really good into Magnus, and then I can kill that Vindicator before it gets a chance to shoot Magnus. And I'm trying to. It's kind of asking your opponent questions that they have to then find the answers to or let you score points. And if they don't want to try and answer those questions, you get to score points, which is great because points win prizes. But if they do want to answer those questions, you just want to use the right pieces so that the answers they have to provide are the pieces that you want them to provide you.
Right. You're putting them between a rock and a hard place that, no matter which unit they put out that makes sense for the situation, they're going to regret putting that out later.
Yes,
How,
exactly.
how do you do your damage then? I know obviously Magnus is a key part of it, but like I see these Thousand Suns turns where they're like, you pick up like 1,600 points of the opponent's army in like one turn. How does that happen?
So it's interesting, right? Because you look at the army and people who have played against Thousand Suns know that they have an insane amount of damage, but it's just a ton of damage won for the most part. You have some big damage pieces that can do a lot, like the Vortex piece have the big beam shots, and now these bows have 2 damage, and Magnus, of course, is big damage. But every Rubric squad, with the exception of exactly the Arcane Vortex, is all just 1 damage shots, right? But they're 1 damage shots which are really efficient because they're either, in at least the case of my army, they're mostly flamers, which means they don't have to roll to hit. And then they get a roll, if they're rolling to wound, they're doing so on objectives, oftentimes, because again, the things we're trying to do is force people to answer the questions, and those questions are often happening on objectives because that puts your opponent onto an objective, thus making it easier to kill. And you get full rerolls to wound when they're on objectives, so that makes your damage rolls much more efficient. You're looking at 75%ers on 4-ups, for example, instead of 50%. It's 25% boost on all of your rolls. Then combine that with things like ignore cover, and then a bunch of spells that help add to the overall damage level of the army. You can cast, for example, Oath of Moments onto something where you get full rerolls to hit for your entire army into a target. You can also take your AP1 ignore cover flamers, which is pretty good in the Space Marines, and then cast a spell on something to make it AP3. And so as long as you're targeting the right stuff in your go turn, and that stuff being the things which are going to do the most damage into you on the attacks back, then you're usually in a spot where your opponent just doesn't have the damage necessary to engage all of your MSU units in a follow-up turn.
So it's not just a one-turn knockout punch. It's a one-turn deal, enough damage and put enough problems on the table that your opponent is now functionally just losing the material war, not coming back. They're just like 2 or 3 units fighting back. It's not going to do it.
I definitely prioritize activations over doing lots of damage to lots of things if I don't put those things down. So to me, it's most important that I put things down so that when my opponent is activating, maybe I kill everything in their army that can really deal damage except for 2 Vindicators. And those Vindicators are the best damage he has. But if he only has 2 Vindicators to do damage, and I have 4 Rubric Marines, squads, only 2 of those Marine squads in the worst case scenario can get killed, right? And those other 2 can then turn back and kill those Vindicators to follow up turn.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. So you're prioritizing the activation economy of your opponent's army and trying to reduce that to basically just counting, right? Like it doesn't matter how great the Vindicator rolls. Most it's going to kill is 5 Rubric Marines. You can't shoot 2 squads. And if you just kind of apply that principle and then reveal 6 Rubric squads and the Goats and Magnus, and you delete 4 squads, your opponent's not going to be able to respond enough. Now, how does that lead to you actually positioning your models and like playing the games? Are you set up with like multiple layers of overkill than going for a fewer number of targets?
I would say that it's what I'm oftentimes trying to do is set up multiple units on multiple units, right? Because there are a decent number of gates in Thousand Suns that you have to cross before you can deal that damage. So you have to roll the number of shots for a unit. You have to roll to successfully get the spells off. You have to, roll the wounds, and then you can re-roll them. Sometimes it's only rolling ones if you're not on the objective. Then they have their saves, right? So there's a bunch of things that are unknown, which are fairly reliable as long as you can kind of manipulate them slightly with what you do. But you don't know them at the time you're committing in your movement phase, right? And so what I try and do is come up with a plan which allows me to have the most backup plans possible for any given scenario, right? So I'm going to move a squad and double move into a position where it can hit multiple things. So that way, if I have another squad fighting a tank, and then Magnus shoots something else, and somehow they both manage to only slightly kill or almost kill those 2 things, but not fully, that other squad, instead of going for a third target, that would be ideal, can instead split fire and finish off those 2 things I didn't kill in the first time.
Yeah, okay, I can see that. And then how does the mission factor into this whole approach? Because everything we talked about has been basically how do you kill your opponent? How does your army score points, Brian?
Um, well, by taking this escalating approach of forcing your opponent to kind of engage you, these questions you're asking your opponent are all the things which are scoring points, right? So it's putting things on objectives, it's scoring secondaries in all core positions, it's controlling space so your opponent can't bring in reserves well, and all of that is allowing you to score points as you go because your opponent isn't going to answer every single question they want, or you pose them, because if they do, they're going to be tabled by turn 3, and then you're going to score all the points anyway, because the damage is so high, right? So what ends up happening is your opponent chooses some questions that you pose that you have to answer, and other ones you score points off of by, that Tzaangor Shaman holds that objective because your opponent didn't want to use a Assault Intercessor squad to kill it, or that Vortex piece required slightly too much of a commitment and your opponent didn't want to do it, or something like that, and you score these primary points you didn't otherwise get earlier in the game. And then usually, because your damage is so high, if you're executing this kind of a plan, then by the end of the game, your opponent is so depleted on resources that the back half of the game, they're not doing very many actions. And also, they're having trouble holding objectives because you frequently have Magnus the Red still alive, who's OC6, and quite powerful for those who don't know. And then also, a couple rubrics around who are these OC2 bodies that are also great at holding objectives, combined with strats that let you sticky objectives and things like that.
Yeah, okay. So it's just like by nature of like playing the damage battle, you are then going to fall into points because you're putting your stuff on the objectives and you're in positions to get secondaries because you're taking kind of an aggressive role at playing Warhammer. Is that the idea?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha. This kind of makes a lot of sense when I think of you as an orc player. Like you're still taking an aggressive line with the Thousand Suns and putting yourself on all the objectives and all that. But when I think of most players playing Thousand Suns, they take a very passive approach. Let's get into the trade war, sacrifice some cultists for some primary, play that pink battle from like distance and range. You don't seem to be interested in doing that. And why is that?
A lot of this has to do with kind of my general philosophy in Warhammer, which is I think that for the most part, people being the average Warhammer 40k player is significantly worse at playing against an aggressive opponent. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they have an overall game plan that they want to execute, right? They have a pacing that they want to operate the game in. I have this tool, I want to use it for this at this time. If you're forcing them to do things which are against whatever game plan they came up with when they were sitting at home, before the event happened, when they wrote up the list, then they have to figure it out on the fly, right? And then a lot of times those decisions aren't optimized, and they make mistakes, or they undercommit in things, or they don't fully appreciate the fact that, I actually needed that unit on turn 3. I should have given them the points instead of not. And of course, the flip side of that is if you try and be too aggressive, and your opponent is good at fighting against that, which there are plenty of players who are excellent at that, some of which are my teammates on Ignite, for example, then you get really badly punished as the aggressive player, right? So it's really finding that balance between that of like, is this a scenario where I can push quite well, and kind of put my opponent into a position where they're doing things that they're not comfortable with, or is this a scenario where they're going to um, be able to really counter me because they have the pieces they need and they're positioned well to be able to kind of do that. A lot of that has to do with visualizing what the game state's going to look like, a turn in advance, and what and that comes with just experience and reps.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. I like how you kind of adapt your approach to more of a player versus player mentality. Like players are kind of not good at the aggressive approach, so you've learned to adapt that style, not just playing the game that you want to play on the table, rather playing the game that you think will, in this specific match, give you the best odds to win. It kind of transcends what your army philosophy and just goes to your play style about it. I think that's super cool.
If you are listening to this, it probably means you play Warhammer 40k. And if you're playing Warhammer, you know you need a lot of dice. Baron of Dice is where we get our dice from. They produce amazing different kinds of dice. We just recently got all kinds of different faction dice shipped to us, which we use on our stream games. But not only do they look really cool, but they're highly customizable. You can get different symbols, corners that are square, corners that are round, different shapes and sizes, different sided dice. It's all the rage. And they're customizable in color and design as well. They are so cool looking. Not only that, but they feel great to roll in your hands. I've never held dice that roll and feel this good. Not only that, but they are scientifically perfectly balanced. There are tons of case studies on people rolling thousands of dice and recording all the results that they get. And sometimes you might get a die that rolls just a few too many ones. We've all had to throw it out before. These dice are not like that. They are perfectly balanced to a T, thousands of rolls, perfect distribution. If you want to take your Warhammer game seriously and make sure the dice are not screwing you over, get some Baron of dice.
With your Thousand Suns, how do you stay alive? You are made of tactical marines, is the famous quote here. And nobody calls tactical marines tough. I get that you're trying to deal that threat overload scenario where you've killed too many units for that activation economy. But at the end of the day, you are playing tactical marines. This is a very optimistic approach to the game. How do you actually do it?
So in the case of Magnus, for example, who's resilient until he suddenly isn't, I tend to be very conservative with him, draw really tight angles, and try and kill things as best as possible from protected spaces, right? So a lot of those questions I'm asking people are trying to make it so that when they answer that question, whatever they use to answer the question is in a position where I can hit it back without exposing myself to even more fire, right? I don't want to trade per se, in the sense of like I trade with him and he trades with me and then I trade with him, right? I want to make it so that I give something which is not worth as much as what he gives me. I kill that thing and then the game state continues from there without my thing getting killed. And so that's where a lot of kind of keeping my stuff alive comes from. I'm also very infrequently using my Rubric Marines until that go turn. My naked squad I'll use a little earlier if I need to, which is why I find it so useful. But the character squads are rarely coming into play until that go turn. I'm kind of using every other piece of my army if I can, when I can, and I'm not too worried about trying to force damage either, right? My opponent's going to use resources in order to play the game. I'm very happy just killing those resources as they come up, because I know that eventually, when we reach the same state where I'm out of chaff and he's out of chaff, he's going to have to use resources, and my punch into him is going to be significantly harder than anything he can throw into me.
Yeah. Okay. I like that whole approach to the game. Basically, just be mindful of ranges and terrain placement, cut the tight angles, create those good trades. It all comes together when you put it together like that. So talk to me about like a little bit of your unit disposal cadence and like what your unit rules here are. I imagine like the Enlightened and the Shaman are here to just help with actions and whatever. What are these naked Rubric Marines doing?
So the naked Rubric Marines are really great for somebody puts a scout squad in the middle of the board, or somebody puts like you put a shaman in the board and they put a assault intercessor squad in the middle of the board, and you don't really want to have to put a vortex piece, let's say, or Magnus into a position where he shoots them, because then the opponent's going to be able to shoot back at that target, right? And you don't really want to trade a 160 point vortex piece for a 90 point squad of guys, right? So what Rubric Marines allow you to do, this naked squad, is stick them into the middle of the board, fight your opponent, and 5 Rubric Marines will most likely kill these kinds of things we're talking about. It's pretty high chance, or at least get it to the point where you don't really care that it's still alive, while putting 10 OC on an objective and being able to cast some spells, and also being relatively difficult to remove. They are, like we were saying, 5 tactical marines, not hard to kill, but they are still 3-up saves, 5 have invulns. Like, they will die if your opponent wants to kill them, but again, it's all about just getting your opponent to have to use real things to fight you.
It's the effort level. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So you just want this escalating effort level out of them, so that your opponent is constantly in a position where they just get tired of taking jabs to the face, and they eventually decide that they want to try and go for a hit on you, and that's when you get to kind of lay the uppercut, if you will, on them.
When I see Thousand Sons players play, their Vortex Beasts are often kind of off to the side behind walls, not just jamming onto objectives. But then when I see you play, sometimes they're just jamming on objectives. What's your thoughts on that?
I have absolutely no problem losing a Vortex Beast if it means that it pulls, maybe if it activates the game, in a meaningful way. So by what I mean by that is, if I put a Vortex Beast on an objective and it results in, say, I'm playing against Blood Angels, their rage. I forget what it's called, the rage fueled captain, I think, the one that's sustained 3, ends up coming out to try and kill this guy, then that's awesome. Or against Ultramarines, it pulls Marnius Calgar's and his company of heroes out onto my objective. And the thought is that my opponent's thought is he's going to give me a 5 and kill a Vortex Beast. If I trade a Vortex Beast for Marnius Calgar and company heroes, that is a awesome trade, right? So I'm very happy to do that. If I'm playing against Emperor's Children and I end up having a Vortex Beast in a spot where it gets shot by a bunch of Noise Marines. Also very happy about that because I just want to kill my opponent's stuff. As long as I'm not using Rubric Marines with characters or exposing Magnus to 2 shots back, then almost any trade I consider worth it. With the Vortex Beast being something which usually, by nature of its defensive stats, requires enough of a trade where it's always going to be worth it anyway.
Yeah, I love it. Makes perfect sense to me. So, okay, Brian, just a couple more questions before we head off to part 2 and cover your actual games. Talk to me about this Cabal situation and how that plays into your games. And I guess it's not really what it used to be, but it is this whole other system that has changed.
Yeah, so the spells are different than they were before. So before they had these Cabal points, and there were these deterministic spells that you could get as you played the game, depending on how many wizards you had left alive, right? And it became this kind of house of cards, where as long as your army was still alive, you could get the most powerful army rules in the game active at all times, and in deterministic ways that were incredibly powerful, right? Now the way it works is you are essentially doing it, for those who might remember from previous editions, the psychic phase, or those who play the old world, casting magic spells. It's this idea of like you pick a spell, you roll 2 dice, and you get some result with the ability to kind of chuck a 3rd dice at it and expose yourself to a little bit of risk. And then those spells have 2 different ways that they can resolve. They have a low casting cost and a high one. The low one being something like reroll 1s to hit, and the high one, and for that same spell, being reroll everything to hit, right? And so what that ends up meaning is that you can turn fairly reasonable units, like I don't think anybody would be upset about putting Rubric Marines as troops in their armies, into units that can kill tanks, right? When you have strength 4 vehicle or flamers going into a rhino that you're wounding on 6s at AP1, ignore cover, you're not that happy. But if it's AP3 and you also got to do D3 plus 3 mortal wounds to that rhino before you even activate it, and you're rerolling wounds, now suddenly you're like, oh, I'm actually pretty likely to kill this thing. And that's where a lot of these spells come in, is they take these units that are already pretty good and turn them into incredibly powerful units that are able to punch up well beyond their standing.
I love it. And then how does your CP management kind of affect this?
I almost always try to only spend CP on Magnus rerolls whenever possible. So
saving 2 CP a turn for that.
Yeah, if I can. There's a bit of a tension with things like you really want to screen your home field and stand on your home field with, say, the Rubric Marine Squad with the Umbralefic Crystal, but then you also want to teleport, right? And the best way to handle that is to stick your objective. But the turn you crystal is also the turn when you want to do the most damage, and do you really want to spend a CP to do that, right? And that's where some of the list design comes back to, right? I have these 3-man unit, this 3-man unit of Tzaangor Enlightened with bows, and they're in the list specifically for that exact scenario, where they just sit on my objectives so that I can use Umbralefic Crystal and not have to spend that CP to sticky my home field, nor to score the primary for it, because they're still standing on that objective.
And that all comes back to the goal of Magnus gets to reroll hits and wounds.
Yeah, exactly, because Magnus is a great tool But when you can reroll hits and wounds, he becomes pretty messed up.
I know, generally speaking, thousands of players like always keep Magnus to the end. You know, he's the king, he's the god. Do you ever find plays where like sacrificing him for early value is actually the move?
Yeah, fairly frequently actually. I won't say that I want to throw him away for free, but if I'm able to put him into a position where I can kill a lot of stuff and then force my opponent to use most of their army to try and kill Magnus, because Magnus on -1 damage is, we're talking about these pieces that activate the game's escalating ladder. He is the highest rung on the ladder, right? He's going to take a lot for your opponent to kill. um so if you can put him into a position where your opponent has to really work hard, and then most importantly put his army into a position where your Rubric Marines can then fight their entire army the next turn, then I'm oftentimes willing to use Magnus in that way. And then it's because Magnus, it's okay if Magnus dies. I don't need him in the end game, right? If the result of using Magnus is I kill a bunch of units and I follow up with they follow up with killing Magnus, and I follow up with killing their army, then I'm very happy about that sequence, right? You just have to understand if that's what's going to happen, and understand exactly what kind of damage Magnus can take, and also where your opponent's going to be in order to do that damage. And as long as you're cognizant of those facts, you can use them quite aggressively, pretty well.
That sounds so easy, but it's so much more complicated. Like, know exactly how much damage Magnus can take and whether or not you'll table your opponent after he's done attacking Magnus, even if he's dead. How do you learn that? Is that just reps?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is experience. A lot of it can also be done, by just kind of running numbers on things, right? There's a lot of common things we see in games. But there is a lot that is kind of going to be experience, right? Like, one of the lessons, for example, I learned last year, while playing Thousand Suns, was just how much damage a single Kazarkan squad can do into Magnus, and how to be so cognizant of them and aware of where they are, right? That's something which you wouldn't necessarily think to yourself, oh, this unit's going to mess me up. But the reality is that unit messes up Magnus quite badly, right? So you got to be really careful about that kind of stuff. And so recognizing what things are going to be really good into you, and kind of where that damage in your opponent's army um, is I think something which comes with experience, and a little bit of kind of just like planning and thinking ahead. Looking at the lists you might expect to place, and the common things you're going to see in the meta, and just getting a feel for it that way is a great way to bootstrap a lot of them.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I don't think you can be a good Thousand Suns player without having a great concept of your opponent's army and how to counterplay it. I think that's part of the nature to it, based on what I'm hearing.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So, just two more questions, Brian. One, what do you like better, the Thousand Suns or the Orcs, personally?
I mean, orcs are my boys. They're always going to be my boys. So, I think right now I'm having fun with the Thousand Suns, but come September we go back to LGT. It's probably going to be green again. Just has to be.
It has to be. That's amazing, dude. Okay. Last question before we head on to part two, folks, and talk about our wonderful, wonderful games with Brian. Brian, if you had a piece of advice you can give a Warhammer player who's trying to get better, what would it be?
I think it's one of these adages. If you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. Really look at that and take that to heed when you're coming to Warhammer and practice reps. If you're sitting there and you're smashing your friends and and everyone else, go somewhere where you're not, right, and then lose a bunch, and then don't just lose, but lose and then try and understand why. Ask your opponents for a little bit of advice on what you might have done better. Come at it, try it again, try and learn. I learn the best in scenarios where I make mistakes, and my opponents exploit those mistakes, and I'm like, oh wow, I hadn't considered that, right? So I would say just that's really it. Just make sure that you are always in a room where you are being challenged, and then you're going to find yourself growing. When you're uncomfortable, you're growing.
That's awesome. I can't agree more with that advice. The stream house literally is that for us. But awesome, Brian. I look forward to playing with you over in Europe and continuing our conversation over for our patrons. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Of course, anytime. Listeners, thank you for listening. We're almost at episode 300. We literally couldn't do this without your endless support for the show. Thank you so much. And we will catch you over at patreon.com/AOW40K for part 2 of this episode. And aside from that, we'll see you next week.
Like what you just listened to? Check out Art of War Down Under and Art of War Unbroken on the competitive 40K network. theartofwar40k.com.